My dear ones, sit with me for a moment, because tonight I want to tell you about something the world doesn't talk about enough. We often speak of a mother's tears, a wife's patience, or a daughter's love, but seldom do we speak of the quiet pain that rests in a father's heart. He's the man who smiles while hiding every worry, who builds a world for his children, brick by brick, and asks for nothing but a little respect in return. And yet, sometimes, that same father is broken, not by fate, not by loss, but by the very child he raised with trembling hands. This is the story, the lesson of a son who broke his father's heart. My dear, let me tell you about a man whose hands told 1,000 stories long before his mouth ever did. He was not a man of fancy words or fine clothes. He did not wear a suit or drive a shining car. He was the kind of man whose life was measured not in the money he earned, but in the love he quietly gave to those he called his own every morning before the sun stretched its golden arms across the sky. He was already awake, his boots scuffed, and ready, his heart steady, with a purpose that never faded. He would sit at the edge of his old wooden bed, tie the same worn laces, and whisper a small prayer under his breath, not asking for much, just enough strength to keep his family safe for one more day. He worked in a small workshop, fixing things that others thought were broken beyond repair: old radios, forgotten bicycles, cracked furniture. He brought them all back to life with those rough hands of his fingers carried cuts, his palms bore calluses, but his eyes carried something much deeper, the kind of kindness that comes from knowing struggle, yet still choosing to smile through it. He was a man who could fix everything, except the distance that was beginning to grow between him and his only son. That boy was his pride, his joy, his reason for everything. The day he was born, the man had held him close and whispered, "You will have everything I never did." He made that promise silently to himself, and it became the song that played in his heart every single day. He wanted to build a better life for the boy, not of gold or luxury, but of dignity and comfort. He wanted his son to walk into a room and never feel small, to speak and be heard, to dream and never feel limited. So he worked through heat and rain, through sickness and fatigue. He worked when his hands trembled and his knees ached. He worked because love does not rest when there is a mouth to feed or a dream to chase. He skipped meals to save a few dollars for his boys' school books. He wore the same coat for 5 winters because his son wanted a new jacket. He smiled when he wanted to cry. He said, "I am fine," when he was not, because that is what fathers do. They build mountains out of pain so their children can walk on level ground. Every night when he returned home, his shirt drenched in sweat, his face dusted with the day's labor, he would peek into his son's room. The boy would be asleep, books scattered across the bed, a small lamp flickering beside him. The father would stand there for a moment, letting the peace of that sight fill him completely. That was his reward. That was his peace, to know that his boy was safe, that his sacrifices had meaning. Sometimes he would brush a hand across the boy's hair, careful not to wake him, and whisper softly, "I am proud of you, my son." As the years passed, the boy grew taller, smarter, louder. He began to dream bigger than the small town that raised him. The father could see the stars in his eyes. And though it scared him, he was proud too. He told everyone who would listen, "My boy will make something of himself one day. You just wait and see." And oh, how he meant it. He never once envied his son's ambitions. He only wished to stand quietly in the background, clapping the loudest, even if no one noticed him. But life has a cruel way of twisting love into longing. The more the boy grew, the less he seemed to see the father who had made him everything he was. The old clothes embarrassed him, the rough hands, the old truck, the simple way of speaking. He started to believe the world belonged only to the polished, and the proud. The father tried to keep up. But how could he? A man who spoke with silence cannot compete with a world that shouts. The boy began to drift away, slowly at first, then completely. The father would still wake before dawn out of habit, but now the mornings felt heavier. The silence in the house began to echo. The chair across the table stayed empty. The laughter that once filled the small home had turned into memories. He still packed 2 lunches out of habit, still poured 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for his son, even though he knew the boy would not be coming home that day or the next. He did not speak of his loneliness. He simply folded it into his daily routine like another chore. He went to work, smiled at customers, fixed their broken things, and said, "Have a good day." Then he would come home and sit by the window where his son used to study. He would watch the sunset, the same one he used to point out to his boy, saying, "Look how beautiful the world is when you stop to see it now." He just watched it alone, whispering the same line to himself, as if hoping the wind might carry it to wherever his son was. Sometimes he would hear from the boy, a quick call maybe. Once a month, words rushed, distracted hello. Dad, how are you? I am busy. I will visit soon. The father would smile into the phone, pretending. That was enough. He would say, take care, son. I am proud of you as always. And after hanging up, he would sit for a long time staring at the wall. The house felt too big for one man. But he never complained, because fathers rarely do. They carry their sadness quietly the way they carry their faith, with patience and dignity. There were moments when the father wanted to tell his son how much he missed him, how proud he was even of the smallest things. But pride and love are heavy things to balance. He didn't want to sound needy. He didn't want his son to worry, so he said nothing, and said everything through his silence. One evening, as he sat outside his workshop, the sun melting behind the trees, a neighbor walked by and said, you must be so proud of your boy. He's made it big in the city now. How the old man smiled, that same gentle smile, and nodded, yes, yes, I am very proud of him then. When the neighbor left, he looked down at his hands, those same tired hands, and whispered softly, I hope he knows. You see, my dear, that is the kind of love that fathers give, the kind that expects nothing in return, the kind that sacrifices without ever asking for thanks. The world does not notice men like him, men who quietly build the dreams of others, men who turn their own pain into someone else's comfort, men who are never celebrated, but always remembered when it is too late. That man's story is not unique. It is the story of many fathers who loved without conditions, who gave until there was nothing left to give, and who watched their children walk away without realizing they were stepping over the very foundation that held them up. He never stopped loving his son. He never stopped hoping that one day the boy would understand that every bruise on his hands, every sleepless night, every quiet tear was not weakness, it was love in its truest form. When I think of him, I think of all the fathers sitting silently in dimly lit rooms looking at old photographs, smiling through tears. They never let fall, waiting for a knock that may never come. A son may break a father's heart without meaning to, but a father's love is a strange kind of miracle. It breaks and still keeps beating. So if you ever find yourself too busy, too proud, or too far away, remember this: somewhere there is a man who still thinks of you every morning when the sun rises and whispers the same simple prayer, God, keep my child safe, and let them know I love them still. My dear, when love begins to fade, it does not vanish all at once. It slips away slowly like the last light of evening, stretching thin, until it becomes memory. The father did not notice at first how far his boy had gone, because the heart refuses to see distance when it loves too deeply. The letters came less often, the calls became shorter, the laughter that once filled their home had been replaced by polite pauses and hurried goodbyes. But he told himself this is how life works. Children grow up and move on. He had done his part. Now it was time to stand back and watch his boy fly. The son had gone to the city, a place that smelled of ambition and noise, a world of bright lights and constant motion. He found friends who spoke quickly and dressed sharply, who laughed at jokes he did not always understand, but pretended to. The city was a different kind of teacher. It whispered that success was louder than kindness, that image mattered more than truth, that the past was something to leave behind and never look back on, and slowly the boy began to believe it. He began to feel ashamed of the things that once made him proud. He stopped mentioning his father's small workshop. When people asked what his family did, he started saying, my father runs a business, because somehow it sounded grander, more fitting for the life he wanted to build. He stopped visiting home as often, telling himself he was busy chasing dreams, but deep down he knew he was running from something, running from the mirror that showed him where he came from. The father, on the other hand, still kept everything the same old chair by the window, the same small frame of his boy on the wall, the same meal at the same hour every evening. When the phone rang, his heart would jump, hopping. It was his son. But it was usually a wrong number or a neighbor calling about work. Still, he kept the phone close, as if holding it tighter would somehow bring the voice he missed the most. Sometimes when he did hear from his son, it was all so quick, so practical. Hello, Dad. How are you? I'm fine. Yes, I'm doing well. Work is busy. Yes, maybe next month I'll come by. The father would listen to the rush of words, trying to find a moment to say, I miss you. But before he could, the call would end with the same line, take care, Dad, I'll talk soon. He would smile at the silence left behind, whispering, God bless you, my son. He tried not to let the loneliness show. He went to work each morning, talked to customers, fixed broken radios and bicycles. He became an expert at mending other people's problems. While his own heart quietly cracked a little more each day, the workshop smelled of oil and dust. But to him, it was the smell of purpose and memory. The sound of his tools became his companion in the long hours that stretched between sunrise and sunset. One afternoon, as he polished a small wooden clock, an old friend stopped by. They spoke about the weather, the harvest, the neighbors. Then the friend asked, "So how's your boy these days?" The father smiled, as always. "Oh, he's doing very well. He's busy in the city. You know how life is." The friend nodded and left. But when the door closed, the smile faded, and the man sat there for a long time staring at the clock in his hands, its steady ticking echoing the emptiness in his chest. At night, he would sit by the window again, the same spot, where he used to wait for his boy to come home from school. He would look out at the quiet street, remembering the sound of small footsteps, running toward him, a backpack swinging side to side, and a voice calling out, "Pa, I'm home." He could almost hear it, sometimes carried by the wind or maybe by memory. He would whisper back, "Welcome home, my boy," though he knew there was no one there to hear it. Meanwhile, the son was learning how cruel the world could be. He was doing well on paper. He had a job, a small apartment, some new friends. But none of it felt like peace. He would lie awake at night, sometimes scrolling through old photos, his father's smiling face staring back at him, with the same warmth that now felt so distant. He wanted to call. But pride is a heavy stone. Once it settles on the heart, it takes courage to lift it. He told himself. He would visit soon, just one more week, one more project. Then he would go home, but weeks became months and months became years, and by then home felt like a place too far to return to easily. On his father's birthday, he almost called. He picked up the phone, dialed the number, and then paused. He imagined his father's voice, soft, steady, filled with love that asked for nothing. He suddenly felt the weight of all the missed calls, all the broken promises, all the silence he had allowed to grow between them. He pressed end before the call could connect. He told himself he'd call tomorrow, but tomorrow has a way of turning into someday and someday into never. Back in that small town, the father sat alone by a cake he had bought for himself, not to celebrate, but to remember. He lit one small candle, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you, God, for one more year. Thank you for my boy, wherever he is." Then he blew out the candle and smiled through the tears that he did not let fall. You see, my dear, distance is not always measured in miles. Sometimes it lives in silence, in the words we do not say, in the visits we keep postponing. It begins small, almost invisible, until one day it becomes a wall between hearts too afraid to reach across. The father tried to keep hope alive like an old lantern, flickering in the dark. He believed that one day his boy would walk through that door again, with the same smile he once had as a child. There were days he would fix something in his workshop and think, "My boy would like this." He would set it aside, a small clock, a carved wooden box, a repaired radio, planning to give it to his son. When he returned, he kept them all neatly wrapped, waiting year after year as the dust quietly gathered. And yet, even as the years slipped by, he never spoke ill of his son. When neighbors whispered that the boy had forgotten his roots, the father would shake his head and say, "No, no, he's just busy. He's doing what I always wanted him to do, living his dream." And in that sentence, you could hear both pride and pain woven together so tightly that even he could no longer tell them apart. The son, too, felt the pull of memory from time to time. Sometimes when he saw a man with tired hands fixing something on the street, he would stop and stare for a moment, reminded of his father. He would think, "I should call him today." But then life would rush in again, meetings, deadlines, traffic messages, all the small excuses that pile up until they feel like reasons. He did not realize that every missed moment was another thread cut from the bond that once held them so strong. And so the distance grew, not through anger, but through absence, through the quiet, slow forgetting that happens when we let life take more from us than it gives. The father grew older, his hair turned white, his steps slower, yet his love remained constant, unwavering, like a lighthouse, shining for a ship that never returns. He still talked to his son, sometimes out loud, as he worked in his shop. "Hey, son, look at this one. I fixed it just like you used to help me. Remember how you'd hand me the nails one by one and laugh when I dropped them?" He would chuckle softly to himself and say, "You were always quicker than me." Then he'd go quiet for a long time, lost between memory and longing. You see, my dear, love does not die when it is ignored. It waits patiently in the corners of time. It waits in the sound of an old clock ticking in an empty room in the scent of sawdust, in a workshop in the quiet hum of the world at sunset, waiting for a voice that will not come. And that is how the distance grew between them, one small silence at a time, one missed visit, one forgotten promise, one unspoken "I love you," until the space became too wide for either to cross easily. The father held on to faith, the son held on to pride, and both held on to love, but in different ways that never met in the middle. Sometimes love's greatest test is not in how much we give, but in how long we can wait, hoping that one day the door will open and the voice we miss will finally say, "I'm home." My dear, there always comes a moment when love meets its limit, not because it stops caring, but because it finally feels the weight of being unseen. The father never thought that day would come. He believed that patience and love could hold anything together, even silence, even distance. But the heart, my dear, has a way of cracking quietly long before it breaks completely. It started with small things, a missed birthday, a forgotten message, a promise that turned into an apology, the kind that says, "I wanted to come, but I couldn't, maybe next time," and next time never seemed to arrive. The father was not angry at first. He simply told himself that his boy was busy, that the world kept him running, and one day he would slow down and remember where home was. He told himself this every night as he looked at the photograph on the shelf, the one with both of them smiling on the boy's graduation day, the father wearing a shirt that didn't quite fit, a cheap tie, and a proud grin, the boy young and bright, his arm around his father, but his eyes already looking somewhere far away toward the life he wanted more than anything. Then came the day that truly tested the father's heart, a day that should have been filled with pride, but instead left a shadow that would never fade. The son had been invited to speak at a grand company event, an evening filled with people. He admired the kind of crowd that looked polished and perfect. He had worked for this moment for years. And when he stood on that stage, he was radiant, confident, charming, the kind of man he always dreamed of becoming. The father watched it live on a small television in his shop, his hands trembling not from age, but from emotion, his heart swelling with pride. He listened as the boy spoke about hard work, about chasing dreams, about never giving up. But when someone asked him about his family, about where he came from, the boy hesitated. He smiled a polite, rehearsed smile and said, "I come from a simple background. My parents passed away. When I was young, I built myself from nothing." And the crowd clapped for his courage. The father sat frozen, the sound of those words cutting deeper than any blade. He felt the air leave his chest. His hands went cold. He did not cry. Not yet. He just sat there staring at the screen, the applause echoing in the small shop that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. The clock on the wall kept ticking, and he could hear each second like a heartbeat, mocking him. His boy had erased him from his own story, as if he had never existed, as if the years of labor, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the love meant nothing. He turned off the television, slowly stood up, and walked outside. The night was still, the air heavy. He looked up at the stars and whispered a question no one could answer. When did I become a ghost to my own child? The next morning he went to work as usual, because what else could he do? He smiled at customers, fixed their broken things, nodded when people talked. But inside something had cracked. He did not speak of it to anyone. He did not even write to his son. He just carried that silence like an invisible wound that refused to heal. Weeks later, the son came home for a short visit. It had been over a year since his last one. He came in a new car, wearing a suit that smelled of city perfume and success. The neighbors gathered around to greet him, proud of the man he had become. The father smiled to his heart, both full and broken. He hugged his boy tightly, the scent of his son's cologne sharp and strange. He whispered, "Welcome home, my son." The boy smiled stiffly. "Thanks, Dad, just for a few days, business stuff." You know, the father nodded. He knew, he always knew. That night they sat together at the table, the same table where they had once shared laughter over simple meals. Now it felt formal, distant. The father served his son the food he used to love. The boy ate quietly, checking his phone between bites. The father asked gentle questions about his work, his life, his health. The boy answered with short, polite replies. It was as if two strangers were pretending to be family. After dinner, the father reached for something he had kept hidden, a small box wrapped in paper. He placed it on the table and said, "I made this for you, a clock for your new office, maybe. You'll like it." The boy unwrapped it. Inside was a handcrafted wooden clock, polished, carefully carved with the words, "My time is yours." The boy looked at it, smiled faintly, and said, "Oh, Dad, you didn't have to make this. You know, I could just buy one." He didn't mean it cruelly, but the words landed heavy. The father smiled and said, "I know, son." But this one is made with love, the boy chuckled softly, and said, I guess I'll find a place for it somewhere. That night the father couldn't sleep. He sat in his chair, listening to the faint ticking of another clock, each sound a reminder of the time passing between them. He thought about all the moments he had missed, the birthdays, the letters, the calls that never came. He wondered if love meant holding on or finally letting go. He wanted to tell his son that it hurt, that it broke him to be forgotten. But he stayed silent, because fathers carry pain quietly. The next morning the boy prepared to leave early. His car, packed, his phone pressed to his ear, talking about meetings and schedules. The father stood by the gate watching him. The boy hung up, hugged him quickly, and said, Take care. Dad, I'll visit soon. The father nodded, said, God be with you, and watched as the car disappeared down the road, the dust rising behind it. He stood there long after the sound faded, whispering to himself, Safe travels, my boy, safe travels. That evening, a neighbor stopped by with a small parcel and said, I saw your son on the news again. You must be so proud. The father smiled and said, Yes, very proud, then closed the door and sat quietly holding the box, the son's gift, still on the table, untouched. He looked at it and whispered, I wonder if he'll ever open the one I made for him. Time moved on, as it always does, and the silence between them became its own kind of conversation, one filled with things neither could say. The father's body grew weaker, but his heart still held on to hope. Some nights he would wake suddenly thinking he heard footsteps outside. He would open the door expecting to see his boy standing there smiling, saying, Dad, I'm home. But it was always just the wind. You see, my dear, the breaking of a father's heart is not always loud. It happens in the quiet, in the small moments, when love is not returned, when pride becomes heavier than affection, when distance turns into denial. That man never stopped loving his son. He simply learned to live with the ache of being forgotten. He still prayed every morning, still thanked God for his boy, still believed that somewhere deep down the son he raised was still there, beneath the success, beneath the pride. And the son, somewhere far away, felt the emptiness too, though he never admitted it. He would see the clock on his desk, sometimes the one his father made, but he had placed it in a corner where no one noticed it, yet every time it ticked, it reminded him of home, of a pair of hands that worked without rest for him, of a love too big to be erased by a single lie. He would stare at it some nights, whispering softly, I'm sorry, though no one could hear. That is how hearts break, my dear, not with anger, but with silence, not with shouting, but with the absence of words. Two people who loved each other too much to stop, but too proud to reach out. And in that space between love and pride, something precious was lost. My dear, time has a strange way of softening the edges of memory, yet deepening the ache of what is missing. The father learned this slowly, day by day, as the seasons turned, and the silence between him and his son stretched like an endless road. The workshop still smelled of oil and wood dust, but the sounds had changed. There was less laughter, fewer visits, more creaking of the old stool beneath his weight. He worked slower now, his hands stiffer, his eyes dimmer, yet his heart still full of the same quiet hope that tomorrow might bring a letter or a call that maybe today his son would remember. Each morning he walked to the post office, though he rarely had mail. He liked the sound of footsteps on the gravel, the way the sun warmed his shoulders, the small greetings from people who still asked about his boy. You must be proud, they would say. He's on television, he's successful, he's made it big. And the father would smile, that same practiced smile, and answer, yes, yes, I am proud, always proud. But when he came home, he would sit by the window and whisper to the empty chair beside him, I wish he knew how much I still miss him. The years passed like pages in a worn book, each day looking a little like the one before. The workshop grew quieter, the tools a little rustier, the town busier around him. People moving on while he stayed where he was, still fixing what others broke, still mending things no one thought could be repaired. Sometimes a young boy from the neighborhood would wander in to watch him work, and he would teach the child how to hold a hammer, how to tighten a screw, how to be patient. He saw a little of his own son in that child, and it brought both comfort and sorrow. He would say softly, take care of your parents, boy, they are your first home, and the child would nod, not really understanding. At night the father would light a small lamp, sit by his table, and read old letters his son had sent long ago, the paper yellowing at the edges, the ink fading, but the words still alive. Hello, Dad. How are you? I miss you. He traced the letters with his finger and smiled, remembering the boy who once wrote them. Then he would fold them carefully and put them back in the drawer, whispering, maybe tomorrow I'll get another one. Far away in the city, the son was living the life he had dreamed of: big office, bright lights, long hours. He had everything he thought he wanted, yet something inside him was restless. He would sit in meetings surrounded by people talking about profits and numbers. But sometimes their voices would fade, and he would see instead the image of his father sitting in that small workshop, the sound of a clock, ticking, the smell of sawdust, the warmth of a simpler time. He would push the thought away, bury himself in work, tell himself that success required sacrifice. Yet at night, when the city went quiet, and he was alone, the silence felt heavy like guilt. One evening, as rain tapped against his window, he found the small wooden clock his father had given him years ago. It had been tucked away in a box, half forgotten. He lifted it gently, the wood still smooth, the carving still clear. "My time is yours," he whispered the words out loud. And for the first time in years, felt something break inside him. He realized that time had passed without mercy. He had built walls of pride and busyness between himself and the one person who loved him without question. He sat there for a long time, listening to the steady ticking, feeling each beat like a heartbeat he had ignored. Back in the small town, the father's body had grown frail, his steps slower, his hands trembling, yet he refused to stop working. He said it kept him alive. Some evenings he would sit outside watching the sunset and talk to himself, or maybe to the sun he still hoped would return. "Do you remember this view, boy?" he would say softly. "You used to sit here and ask me why the sky changes color. I told you it's because even the sky gets tired of being the same every day and wants to feel new again." He would smile at the memory, close his eyes, and whisper, "I wonder if you still look at the same sky." The neighbors looked after him as best they could, bringing him soup, checking on him now and then, but the house felt emptier with each passing year. He kept the son's room untouched, the bed neatly, made the books still on the shelf, as if waiting for the door to open someday he would dust the table, rearrange the pillows, talk to the silence, and say, "I'm keeping it ready just in case he comes home soon." Sometimes the son dreamed of that house, dreamed of walking through the door, hearing his father's laugh, feeling his embrace again. He would wake up sweating, heart pounding, and tell himself, "I'll visit next month." But next month always turned into next year, until even he lost count of how many birthdays he had missed. He sent gifts, money, cards, but never himself, and the father received them with trembling hands, smiling sadly, as he said to no one at all, "He remembered me. He always remembers." Then came a winter colder than most. The father fell ill, a small sickness at first, but his body too tired to fight it. He stayed in bed by the window, still watching the sky, still waiting. One afternoon, he asked the neighbor to bring him the wooden box where he kept his letters and small treasures. Inside was a photograph of his son from years ago. He held it gently, tracing the smile, and whispered, "I hope you're warm, I hope you're safe." Then he closed his eyes for a while, letting the sunlight touch his face. Far away, the son sat in his office, staring at the same clock his father had made. It had stopped ticking. He tapped it lightly, but it stayed still. He thought to himself, "I should get it fixed." And for some reason, those words felt like a message echoing from miles away. He suddenly felt the urge to call, to hear his father's voice, to tell him everything he never said. He picked up the phone, dialed the number, but it rang and rang unanswered. He told himself maybe he's asleep, maybe tomorrow, and set the phone down, unaware that sometimes tomorrow never comes. Days later, the news reached him, a letter from a neighbor written in trembling handwriting. "Your father passed peacefully. He spoke your name before he slept." The son sat there frozen, unable to breathe, the city noise fading into nothing. He read the line again and again, as if understanding it could change it. His father passed peacefully. He spoke your name before he slept. He felt something inside him collapse. He realized that every tomorrow he had promised had stolen a piece of today that would never return. He went back to that small town, the same road, the same air, but everything felt different, quieter, heavier. He walked into the house that once felt too small, now feeling too empty. He touched the chair by the window, the tools in the workshop, the clock still hanging on the wall, ticking faintly again. As if it had started for him, he sat down, whispered, "I'm here. Did I came home? I'm sorry I took so long." And my dear, that is how silence speaks. It tells stories. Words cannot. It holds both love and regret in the same breath. Years of silence had passed between them, yet the love never left. It simply waited, patient and loyal, like the father himself. You see, when love is true, even time cannot erase it. It lingers in the corners of old rooms, in the ticking of forgotten clocks, in the way sunlight falls on an empty chair. It waits for forgiveness that comes too late and gives peace that comes quietly. A son stood in that quiet house as the light of late afternoon painted soft gold across the floor, every corner whispering pieces of a life he had left behind. He could hear the faint hum of the past in the creak of the floorboards, and the ticking of the clock that now seemed to beat in rhythm with his heart. He walked through each room, touching the worn edges of tables, the cracked frame of the photograph, the little marks on the door where his father had measured his height year after year. Everything spoke to him, everything forgave him without needing words. He moved slowly like a man afraid of waking a memory. And in a way, he was, because memories can be louder than any voice when they are filled with love and regret. He sat down on the old chair near the window, where his father had watched the sky for years, the same sky, now stretched wide and gray above the trees, and the wind carried that faint smell of pine and rain. He closed his eyes and felt the air move through the house, soft and sad like a sigh. And he said quietly, "I came home, Dad. I'm here now. I'm sorry. I thought I was chasing a future, but I was really running away from everything that made me who I am." He stayed like that for a long time, just breathing, just listening to the silence that had once felt heavy, but now felt almost holy, like the house itself was forgiving him. After the funeral, he didn't leave right away. People in town said he could stay as long as he liked, and he did, because leaving again felt impossible. He found peace in the small rituals his father once did. He woke early, made coffee in the same dented pot, walked to the post office. Even though there was no mail, he cleaned the workshop, while the tools swept the floor, and every small task felt like a prayer, like a way to talk to his father without speaking. He began to fix small things for the neighbors, just as his father had a squeaky chair, a broken radio, a watch that wouldn't tick. He asked for nothing in return, only that they share a story about the man who had been his father, and each story became a thread, sewing together pieces of the man he had forgotten. One evening, a young boy came by carrying a broken toy truck. He said his mother told him the old man used to fix things here, and the son smiled and said he did, but he's gone now. "Still, I can try." He took the toy, sat at the workbench, and for a moment his hands trembled, then grew steady as he found the rhythm of the work, the way his father's hands once moved, strong and certain. When the toy came back to life, the boy grinned wide, and the son felt something open inside him, something warm and real, maybe for the first time in years. He said softly, "There you go, kid, remember to take care of it." And the boy said, "I will, thank you, mister." He watched him run off down the road and whispered, "You're welcome, Dad." The next day he went through old boxes, letters, photographs, pieces of a life, stitched together with love and patience. He found a note written in his father's uneven handwriting. It said, "My son, if you ever read this, I want you to know, I never wanted more than to see you happy. I was proud long before the world was proud, and I never stopped waiting for your knock on the door." He pressed the paper to his chest and cried quietly, the kind of tears that wash away years of silence, tears that come when the heart finally accepts that forgiveness was always waiting. He started talking to his father while he worked, just little things: "You'd laugh if you saw me now," or "I fixed the Miller boy's chair today," or "Remember how you said patience makes the work better?" And slowly those conversations filled the empty air until the house no longer felt lonely. It felt alive with memory. One afternoon, he went outside to the old tree by the fence, the one they used to sit under after long days, and he carved 2 initials side by side, a small, simple mark, but it felt like a promise. That love had never really gone anywhere. It had just been waiting here under this same sky. As weeks turned into months, he began to notice how life around him moved differently here. People took time to talk to each other. They remembered birthdays. They helped one another without asking why. It humbled him the way kindness was woven into the fabric of this little town. He realized his father had been part of that quiet goodness, building more than furniture. He had built trust, community, love, without ever saying the words. And the son thought to himself, maybe that is the truest kind of success, not the kind with applause or trophies, but the kind that lives on in the way people remember you when you're gone. One night he sat on the porch, watching the stars flicker through the dark, the air cool, the crickets singing, and he spoke softly, as if his father were sitting beside him. "You know, Dad, I used to think love was supposed to be loud, full of words and grand gestures. But you showed me it can be quiet, steady, the kind that fixes what's broken without anyone asking, the kind that waits and forgives and keeps the light on just in case someone finds their way home again." He looked at the horizon where the sky met the fields and smiled, feeling at peace in a way he never had before. The following morning, he decided to keep the workshop open, not as a business, but as a place for others to come and learn. He called it the time room after the clock. His father had made he taught children how to sand wood, how to polish, how to repair. He told them stories about his father, each story, ending with the same words: he believed in fixing things, not throwing them away. One day, a small girl asked him, "Why do you do this if you don't need the money?" And he smiled and said, "Because some things you do just keep love alive." Letters started arriving from people who had moved away, but remembered his father. They shared memories of laughter, of kindness, of quiet wisdom. He kept each letter pinned to the wall until it looked like a tapestry of gratitude. He realized then that though his father's hands were gone, his touch still lived in everything he had repaired and everyone he had helped. Years passed, and the son grew older, his hair grayer, his hands rough again from work. But his heart lighter. He found joy in the simplest of things: the smell of rain, the sound of a child's laughter, the warmth of morning light through the window. One evening, he walked down to the river where he and his father used to fish. He sat on the same rock, felt the cool breeze, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me, for teaching me that it's never too late to come home." When he returned to the workshop, he lit the lamp one last time, the glow soft and golden over the wood and metal. He picked up the clock that had once stopped ticking, held it close, and listened. The ticking steady, now sure like the heartbeat of a promise kept. He smiled, closed his eyes, and said, "Good night, Dad, see you in the morning." And my dear, that is how return truly feels: not grand, not loud, not filled with applause. It is quiet, humble, honest. It is the moment you realize that home was never just a place. It was a person. It was love, patient enough to wait through years of silence, strong enough to forgive without being asked. When the son came back, he did not just return to a house, he returned to himself. And in that moment, both father and son found peace. My dear, when life has shown you all its storms and calmed again, it leaves behind a stillness where truth begins to whisper. And that is where the son found himself years later, not in noise or pride or glittering rooms, but in that still quiet where love speaks the loudest. He had learned that time does not wait for anyone. It only watches to see if we use it with kindness or let it slip away. He would wake each morning to the sound of birds outside his window, stretch his aging hands and whisper, "Thank you," because every sunrise now felt like a second chance. He had missed too many mornings. Before, he had chased too many things that vanished like dust in sunlight. Now he understood that what matters most cannot be bought or built. It can only be held close and cared for. He spent his days in the same small house, the one his father built with steady hands and a heart full of patience. He walked through the rooms slowly like a man visiting sacred ground. Every mark, every scratch, a story of their life together. He kept the workshop open, still mending things, still teaching, though his hands were slower, his eyes softer. He told the children who came by, "You must always fix what you can, because fixing is a way of loving. When something breaks, you do not throw it away. You listen to it, you give it time." That is what my father taught me, and they would smile, not fully understanding, but storing the words like seeds they would one day need. On some evenings, he sat by the window with tea and looked at the sky changing colors, just like his father once did. The same sky that had watched over them both through all those years of silence and distance now seemed kinder. As if forgiving them both, he thought about how easily love can be taken for granted, how words left unsaid can grow heavier than any burden. And he whispered into the fading light, "I will not waste another day, not one." He began writing letters, not to send, but to speak to the past. Letters to his father, letters to the boy he used to be, each one ending the same way: "Thank you for waiting for me." People in town often came by to visit, they said. He reminded them of the old man who used to fix their chairs and clocks. He would smile quietly and say, "I learned from the best." Sometimes the children asked, "What happened to your father?" And he would tell them, "He taught me everything I forgot, then taught me again." Without saying a word, they never really understood what he meant. But that was all right. Some lessons are meant to be felt, not explained. He started keeping a small journal, writing thoughts each night, small things that felt big when written. "I saw a boy today who looked like me at 16. I fixed a clock that ticked like his. I heard laughter from the street, and it sounded like home." His words were simple but full of the kind of peace that only comes when a heart has forgiven itself. Sometimes he would close the book, smile, and say softly, "I hope you're proud, Dad." And somewhere in that quiet space between night and morning, he felt like his father was still there, nodding gently, as if to say, "I always was." Years passed, the seasons turned as they always do, and the man who had once been lost in noise and ambition now found joy in silence. He walked slower, spoke softer, laughed More easily, he had learned that strength was not in stubbornness, but in gentleness, that love was not in grand gestures, but in steady presence. One afternoon, as he sat beneath the old tree, by the fence, the one where he had carved their initials, he noticed how strong it had grown, how deep its roots had gone, and he thought to himself that love was just like that, quiet, unseen, but holding everything together. The children who once came to learn were grown now. Some brought their own kids and said, "We still remember your stories, Mr. Harris. You told us never to throw away what's broken." He would chuckle and say, "Well, that goes for people too, my dear." And they would laugh, thinking it was a joke, but his eyes told them it wasn't. He had seen enough broken hearts and mended enough pieces to know that love, like wood, can be sanded, shaped, restored, if only you have the patience. Sometimes at night, he would dream of the old days, the sound of his father's hammer, the warmth of their small dinners, the laughter that once filled the house. He would wake up smiling instead of crying. Because the memories no longer hurt, they healed. He realized that grief changes over time. It does not disappear. It becomes a quiet companion walking beside you, reminding you that love was real and that it mattered. One winter morning, he felt tired more than usual. He sat by the window with a blanket over his knees, watched the frost gather on the glass, and whispered, "It's a beautiful day, Dad. I think I'll rest for a while." He closed his eyes, still smiling, and the clock on the wall ticked softly, steady, sure, as if keeping time for two hearts that had finally found each other again. When the neighbors found him later, they said he looked peaceful, like a man who had just finished a long journey and come home at last. They buried him beside his father under the same old tree, the one that had watched over both their lives, and the town folks came to say goodbye. But they didn't cry for long, because they said he had already taught them how to keep love alive in every small kindness, in every mended thing, and in every story that began with once. There was a man who learned too late but loved just time. And my dear, that is the lesson I want you to remember, because life has a way of testing how deeply we love. It gives us people not to own, but to cherish, moments not to waste, but to live through fully. And when we forget, it quietly waits for us to remember, just as that father waited for his son. Love never stops waiting. It simply sits by the window, watching the sky change colors, whispering, "Come home." So if you have someone you love, call them. If you have words you've kept in your heart, speak them. If you have forgiveness to give, do not wait for the perfect moment. The perfect moment is always now, because one day time will stop ticking, just like that old clock, and the only thing left will be the stories we told and the hearts we touched. Remember, my dear, broken things can be mended, but only if you are willing to hold them gently enough. And as the night settles in and I pour myself a cup of tea, I can almost hear that father's laugh carried in the wind, soft and warm, and I smile, because even though they are both gone, their story still lives on, reminding us all that love, once given, never truly leaves. It simply changes form, turning into light, into memory, into the soft voice that tells you to keep believing, to keep forgiving, and to keep loving. That is the lesson of the son who broke his father's heart and then mended it again, one quiet day at a time. Thought maybe we could visit, not to buy, just to see. I nodded, unable to speak, because my heart was pounding with a mix of nostalgia and something softer, hope. That weekend we drove to the village, the same one where my husband and I had once stood, young and uncertain, yet full of dreams. It hadn't changed much. The air still smelled of seaweed and pine. The streets were narrow cobblestone paths lined with flowers and small shops selling seashell trinkets and postcards. When we reached the cottage, I stood there for a long time, my breath caught in my chest. It was smaller than I remembered, but it carried the same warmth. It always had the same inviting charm, the windows framed by wildflowers, the porch still facing the endless blue. I turned to my son and said quietly, "Your father would have loved that you brought me here." He smiled and said, "I think he's already here." We walked along the shore after that, our feet sinking into the wet sand as the tide whispered around us. I told him stories he had never heard about his father, about the time we stayed up all night during a storm, afraid the roof would blow off, and how we sang old songs to distract ourselves, about how his father carved our initials on a piece of driftwood and promised he'd never let me face anything alone. He listened quietly, his expression soft with something between sorrow and peace, and when I finished, he said, "You know, Mom, I used to avoid hearing stories about Dad because they made me feel like I'd missed too much, but now they make me feel like I'm finally getting to know him." And I said, maybe that's what stories do, they bring people back to us piece by piece. That night we stayed in a small inn overlooking the ocean. I couldn't sleep. The sound of the waves kept pulling me back into old memories. My son must have sensed my restlessness, because he knocked on my door holding 2 mugs of cocoa. He sat beside me on the balcony and said softly, "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately. I think I understand him more now. He wasn't just my father, he was your home, your compass. And losing him must have felt like losing half of yourself." I looked at him and said, "You don't really lose someone like that. You just start carrying them differently. At first, it's heavy like an anchor. But over time, they become lighter like the wind, guiding you without you even realizing." He nodded and said, "I think that's what you've become for me, Mom, my anchor and my wind." And I had to look away because my eyes filled with tears. The next morning, we returned home, but something inside both of us had shifted. There was a quiet closeness between us, one that didn't rely on words. We began to spend more time together, not out of obligation, but out of comfort. He'd call me from work just to ask how my day was, or send me photos of the sunset, saying, "This one looks like the beach we used to go to." I started writing again, not letters this time, but stories, little reflections about life, love, and forgiveness. Sometimes I'd read them aloud to him in the evenings. While we sat drinking tea, he'd listen and say, "You should publish these, Mom. People need to hear your stories." I'd laugh and say, "Oh, who would listen to me?" But he'd always reply, "I would," every time. One afternoon, I found him sitting quietly by the window, a faraway look in his eyes. When I asked what he was thinking, he said, "I used to think strength meant not feeling things, just pushing through, pretending it didn't hurt when something broke. But you've shown me that real strength is in feeling everything, and still choosing to love, still choosing to show up." I reached over and took his hand and said, "That's what your father believed too, and maybe that's the lesson we were both meant to learn together." He smiled then, and I could see his father in him so clearly, the way his eyes softened, the way he carried his heart just a little too openly. It made me ache and heal all at once. Months turned into a year, and our lives found a new balance. One evening, as we were cooking dinner, he suddenly said, "I did something I wanted to tell you about. I bought a small piece of land near the coast, not for now, but for someday when I have a family of my own. I want them to have a place where they can hear the sea like I did growing up, a place that feels like peace." I didn't answer right away because my throat was tight with emotion. Then I said softly, "That's beautiful." And he smiled, saying, "Maybe we'll call it Second Tide. Remember that name we came up with last year?" I nodded because I remembered, and because I realized that name wasn't just about a place, it was about us, our second chance at love, understanding, and forgiveness. Years later, I would often visit that piece of land with him. Sometimes we'd plant trees, sometimes we'd just sit watching the waves roll in and out. One afternoon, he brought his wife and their newborn son to the shore. He placed the baby in my arms and said, "His name is Samuel, after Dad." I looked down at the tiny face, eyes barely open, lips curling into the smallest smile, and I felt time fold in on itself, like every chapter of our story had led to this moment. I whispered, "Welcome home, little one," because that's what it felt like, a homecoming. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting everything gold, I looked at my son holding his child and thought about how far we'd come. We had broken each other once unintentionally, through pride and misunderstanding. But somehow we had rebuilt something stronger, something that would outlast both of us. I realized then that love isn't about holding on to what was, it's about creating what can still be. It's about knowing that even when something precious slips away, it leaves behind a seed of grace waiting to grow again when the time is right. Later that night, as I sat alone by the window listening to the distant echo of the ocean, I felt my husband's presence again, not as a ghost, but as a feeling, a quiet certainty that everything had come full circle. And I whispered into the night, "Thank you for giving me this second tide, for teaching me that endings are only beginnings in disguise." And as the moonlight spilled across the room, soft and silver, I closed my eyes and felt a deep, still peace, the kind that comes when every piece of your heart has finally found its place. Had hardened, but that day I picked up my gloves and started again. I dug into the earth and felt something heal with every handful of soil. It was as if the act of planting new life in old ground mirrored what was happening inside me. Sometimes peace requires you to return to the places you've avoided, to face them with new eyes, and to plant something beautiful where pain once lived. That night I sat on the porch watching the stars and thought about how every loss, every heartbreak, every unanswered prayer had led me here, not to a life without pain, but to a heart that could hold it without crumbling. And I realized that peace was not about being untouched, it was about being unshaken. Peace was not fragile, it was steady, it was the deep knowing that no matter what happens you are still whole. I whispered thank you to the sky, not because everything made sense, but because I had finally learned. Live without needing it too. I began to see that peace grows when you stop waiting for others to understand you, to apologize, to fill your empty spaces. Peace begins when you take responsibility for your healing, when you stop saying I'll be okay when, and start saying I am okay now. It's not arrogance, it's acceptance, it's the understanding that your peace is not dependent on the actions or approval of anyone else. It's between you and God, between your breath and your soul, between your truth and your silence. There was a moment when I sat with a friend who was going through her own grief. She said, "How do you ever stop feeling broken?" And I told her, you learn to live beautifully with the cracks, they let the light in. And that's what peace looks like, not perfection, but light pouring through the places that hurt the most. She cried, and I held her hand. And in her tears, I saw my old reflection, the one who thought she'd never heal. And I silently thanked the version of me who never gave up, because peace is the reward of those who keep showing up even when they don't feel ready. As the seasons changed, I started spending more time near the ocean. Something about the rhythm of waves reminded me of how life moves in cycles, always retreating, always returning. One evening, I walked along the shore barefoot, feeling the cool water brush my ankles. And I realized that I no longer feared the unknown. I no longer needed to hold on to every memory so tightly. The tide took away some shells and left new ones. And that felt like life taking some things I loved and giving me new reasons to keep going. I closed my eyes and whispered, peace isn't found in holding on, it's found in knowing when to let go. Over time, I became softer, not weaker, but gentler with myself, with others, with the world. I used to think peace meant strength, meant being unbothered. But now I know it's the quiet courage to feel everything and still choose love to be hurt, and still stay kind to be afraid, and still take the next step. Peace is not a destination. It's a daily decision to choose calm over chaos, grace over resentment, trust over fear. Every morning, when I wake up, I remind myself, you can't control the waves, but you can choose how you stand in them. There are days when the ache still returns unexpected, like a song I forgot I knew. But it doesn't consume me anymore, it passes through me like a breeze, gentle and familiar. Because now I know peace isn't about escaping the past, it's about learning to coexist with it. It's about honoring what was without being held captive by it. I've learned that some memories are meant to stay, not to hurt, but to remind you of how deeply you loved and how much you've grown. Sometimes when I walk past the mirror, I see her again, that younger version of me, the one who begged God for peace with clenched fists and tear-stained cheeks. And I wish I could tell her that peace doesn't come as a lightning strike, it comes quietly. It comes slowly, it comes when you start believing you deserve it. It comes when you forgive yourself for the mistakes that keep replaying in your mind. It comes when you realize that nothing was wasted, not the tears, not the silence, not the waiting. Now when I talk about peace, I don't describe it as something distant or divine, but as something deeply human. I tell people peace lives in the way you speak to yourself, in the way you show kindness, in the way you breathe through the storm. It's not a gift God gives to the lucky. It's a truth He plants in all of us, waiting for us to uncover it. It's the soft voice that says you're safe, even when the world says otherwise. It's the warmth that fills you when you choose to love again after loss. And sometimes late at night, when I sit with a cup of tea and the world is quiet, I feel that presence again, that sacred calm that tells me I am exactly where I need to be. I smile and whisper to myself, peace isn't something God gives when life is easy, it's something He builds in you when life is not. And that realization is what changed everything. Because now I no longer pray for a peaceful life, I pray for a peaceful heart. And that makes all the difference. Peace is not found in avoiding pain. It's found in embracing it with faith. Peace is not found in perfect moments. It's found in imperfect ones that teach you grace. Peace is not waiting somewhere ahead, it's already within you. And when you finally stop running long enough to feel it, you'll realize that God never withheld peace from you. He was shaping you to receive it all along.